So let's take a look at the second reading from Dante, De Monarchia, or On World Government. Where have we been? Well, he is really, taking on this pretty big issue, and you know, what I want to say about Dante is he's writing at a different time, and he's writing from a different worldview, I suppose. And one of course, kind of the big idea here is that there should be a world government. That is, there should be what he's imagining. I'm getting is that he believes there should be one single political structure for the whole of humanity, a world government, which is just the sort of thing that I guess so many people hate. There's so many conspiracy theories running around these days about the new world order and all these secret conspiracies. And you kind of have to put all that aside. What we're doing is looking at a political document, a political theory, a political opinion from another time. And it may be that I think most of us probably at the end of the day will say this is a crazy idea, that there should be a single world government. What he's really thinking of as an empire. And one of the things you have to, I think personally have to keep in mind is that for a medieval European, the shadow of the Roman Empire, the historical memory of this tremendous thing that has, that fell apart, really more or less 1,000 years before. But for an educated European, the classical world is the focus of their education, their intellectual horizon. So the shadow of the Roman Empire is there. That is this time when there was this not world government, but this unified government over a very large area of what to them was the known world, is in the back of his mind. And so that's there. But it's just that you have to sort of appreciate its own logic. Let's review where we've been. Dante has said that, to really have a political theory, a theory of what he calls temporal government, you have to have a notion of what the purpose of human civilization actually is. And he says that it's intellectual growth, the growth of knowledge, the growth of culture, the growth of mankind or humankind's finding truth, wisdom, and understanding. And that what you need for that is peace. Without peace, you won't have the conditions under which that can occur. So the question is, how can you achieve peace? And I think that the logic is you achieve peace through political unity. So you eliminate wars, you eliminate factionalism, you eliminate dissension, all the things that are destructive, his mind, to peace. And I think that you can see he's going towards, well, you have to have a unified government. You have to have stability to avoid those kind of conflicts, to avoid that kind of dissension, heading towards something like a world government, a unified government. No, as we'll see, it's not just like one governmental structure. It's perhaps he's imagining a kind of a complicated thing where local governments relate to more comprehensive, and finally to a single world government. So it wouldn't be something simple, but it would be something that was unified by a single ruler. What he's thinking of really is a single monarch. And that's what he says here in the beginning of section 5. To achieve this state of universal well-being, a single world government is necessary. And I think that this section gives you an insight into the general sort of way that he thought, which was, again, when he says the philosopher here, right? You see right here, the philosopher. He's talking about Aristotle, and that is, this classic thing where medieval thinkers referred to Aristotle simply as the philosopher because he was just so important to them. Thomas Aquinas does the same thing. It gives you an insight into the way that he thinks, which is, again, like a kind of an Aristotelian way that, as he says here, Whenever several things are united into one thing, one of them must regulate and rule, and the other must be regulated and ruled. This notion that there has to be a hierarchy. As we move towards modern political theory, more and more I think thinkers try to make things horizontal in terms of political rule rather than vertical. Liberalism, as we'll see, is, I think, in its classic form, is an idea that a community of individuals should all be self-ruling, and that power should not be exercised from above down to those below, but should be spread out throughout a society somehow. Now, that is a modern idea of ours, I think. We modern people, not the one that was as widely shared by the ancients and medieval thinkers. So this notion that there has to be a ruler for things to be in order, for things to be properly functioning and in order, there has to be a ruler, and that's really, I think, exemplified in this, where he talks about the proverbial curse, "May you have an equal in your home." Basically, the proverbial curse is, "May you have an equal in your home." That would be a terrible thing, right? Because then no one would be in charge, and there'd be chaos and disorder. There has to be, as he says, there has to be someone in charge for things to work properly. That is the way that he thought, right? For things to reach their proper end, right? So this notion of a hierarchy is very, I think, deeply entrenched in his way of thinking. For things, as he says, for things to reach their goal, there has to be order, and for there to be order, there has to be some form of hierarchy. That is, some entity that's ruling clearly and some entity that is ruled. We see here in part 6 a further argument or further explanation of this general view that there needs to be a unity for things to work. And also for, more specifically, this sort of Aristotelian way of thinking that everything has a purpose, everything has a goal, an aim, a good, a final end that it is striving towards. And that is especially true of human society. He has a very interesting idea here in section 6 of the double structure among things. And he's talking about the double structure amongst groups or communities. There is the relation of the different parts to each other, and then there's a relation of the different parts to the end goal, to the whole. And as he says here towards the bottom of the page, the relations among parts exist for the sake of the unifying structure, not vice versa, which is an interesting way of thinking. You and I, as citizens, let's say, have relations to each other, but those relations are subsumed or are for the sake of our relation to the whole, to the end or purpose of the community as a whole. That is, that the end or purpose or the community as a whole is the dominant thing, the thing for the sake of which everything else is sort of structured. Let's see if we can follow his reasoning at the end of the section here. Starting here, but he says, "But as we have seen sufficiently clearly in the preceding chapter, this unifying structure is found in all parts of human society. Therefore, it is found, or should be found, in mankind as a whole. And as those societies that are partial in a state, and the state itself, as we saw, should be composed of a structure unified by a governor or government, so there must be a single world ruler or world government." It's an interesting way of thinking. I'm not sure the logic there or the reasoning is quite clear. But it is this sort of hierarchical thinking, that you and I as individuals are directed towards a certain community as a whole, and that community as a whole is directed towards something else, and finally up to what he's imagining is the single community, which is the community of human beings as a whole, which is, another idea that maybe is not in fashion right now, the idea that humanity, what used to be called mankind, humanity as a whole constitutes a certain type of community. That is, human beings as such are members of one single group. the whole of humanity, the whole of the species. And he's thinking that in order for that group to achieve its purpose, there has to be a single government for that community, which is an extremely interesting idea and is something, again, that, the rhetoric of especially American politics right now is very much against that. The sort of anti-globalization, the suspicion of international institutions. But Dante, he's a cosmopolitan. He's trying to transcend national identities, ethnic identities, particular group identities, and think of the good of humanity as a whole. One might think, of course, of institutions like the United Nations, which are certainly not the world emperor with that kind of power that Dante is imagining, but is something along those lines. That is, the United Nations represents the single institution that in some way or another is representative of humanity as a whole. Of course, it's not, it doesn't have that much power, but at least it exists as an institution. So we could call, I think, Dante in contemporary terms a kind of globalist, someone who believes that human beings as a whole have to unite together. And, it's something to think about. Of course, we can see dangers with that. But on the other hand, given the kind of problems that humanity is faced with, most pressing right now, the problems of the coronavirus, of COVID-19 and dealing with that, but also other problems, especially, I would say, the most lethal and difficult problem, the problem of global warming. Some form of real international cooperation might be absolutely necessary to solve those problems. And one wonders if the kind of international cooperation that would be necessary would be possible under anything else but a world government. It's an interesting hypothesis, at least, I think. If we look at sections 7 through 9, I think we get another insight into what is structuring, influencing Dante's view of what politics should be, of what empire should be, of what human community should be. And that is a really important aspect of it, and that is that it's essentially a theological view. That is, it's a view that has God as its sort of foundation. And of course, this is medieval Europe, he's a Christian. So it's the God of Christianity, God of the Bible, Jehovah, the classical monotheistic vision of God, of Christianity. He's saying you have to view human society within the theological view of the universe as a whole. That is that, and maybe that's the big message here, is that human beings, in how they form their political institutions, how they form their societies, have to fit into a divine order. That is, thinking of nature, the universe, the cosmos as a whole as being ruled by God in this hierarchical way, human beings in their societies, in the way they live their lives and in the way they group the way that they structure their group life, their politics, should conform to the theological, to the order of the universe, which is, of course, the order for him, of the universe ruled by God's providence. And he has this idea that, what does he say? Mankind, he says here on top of the page, mankind resembles God most when it is most unified. That is, we should seek to perfect the order of our societies and make them really godlike, I guess. And the more unified they are, the more godlike they are. So it's a very interesting idea, I think. As he says in section 9, mankind is best when it follows in the footsteps of heaven as far as its nature permits. So Dante is really very ambitious thinker. He's thinking that human societies have to keep in mind that they're part of the order of the universe, and the more unified they are, the more they resemble God in his unity, and therefore a world government, because of course it would be more unified. That means that humanity as a whole would be more unified, therefore is better because it more resembles the divine image. Really wild thinking here. There's a lot of philosophical, metaphysical stuff going on in Dante's ideas here. And one of them here in section 10 is the idea of judgment. He says, wherever there can be contention, there judgment should exist. Think about his worldview of God ordering the universe. In the physical universe, things happen according to the natural laws, say, of physics. But in the human world, politics, ethics, there needs to be judgment. Meaning things aren't so clear and somebody has to make a decision. This happens, he says, especially when two different nations or states come into conflict, two governments come into conflict. There needs to be a judgment. There needs to be some sort of solution that's come up with to solve the contention, the conflict. And he thinks clearly that means it needs to be a third power. Say that the United States and Russia are in conflict. The United States and China, or China and Russia, or India and China. Dante thinks that it just follows that there has to be some sort of power above them that will adjudicate between that conflict, and that's world government. He quotes again the philosopher at the end of the section, of course, Aristotle. The philosopher saw this argument when he said, things hate to be in disorder, but a plurality of authorities is disorder. Therefore, authority is single. Again, I think that Dante is really thinking of, as a model, thinking of the Roman Empire, which was, there was all these different communities, ethnicities, religions, languages. But above them was the Roman authority that would adjudicate any kind of dispute. I think he's thinking that that would be the way that the whole world should be, that the whole of humanity should be. So if we look at the last section of this reading, really quite remarkable. Again, what we're exploring here. And we're exploring the thought of somebody from a different age. And we're seeing, what we can get out of it. I don't expect anybody to swallow this whole. But a really remarkable section here, section 11, the world government is apt to be least greedy and most just. Now, I don't know if these arguments really hold water, but they're really quite remarkable. What is he saying here? That a world government, and basically that means an emperor, one person at the top, would provide the most justice. As he says, would be least greedy and most just. Why? Well, if we skip his, formal use of the syllogism here, I don't think it's really something I want to get into too much. As he says here, as evidence for this, we must note that greed is the extreme opposite of justice. Take away greed completely, and nothing opposed to justice remains in the will. Hence the opinion of the philosopher that whatever can be decided by law should not be left to a judge, is based on the fear of greed, which readily twists the minds of men. Now, where there is nothing left to desire, greed is impossible, for passions cannot exist when their objects are destroyed. But a universal ruler has nothing that he still desires, for his jurisdiction is bounded only by the ocean. Hence, he says, hence it follows that the world ruler is the purest among mortal wills in which justice may reside. I guess the idea is that if there were a world ruler, a world emperor, then that person would be the most just, because there'd be no greed that could possibly get in the way of judgment, because the world ruler rules everything already. So there's no conflict of interest, I suppose, is the idea. There's nothing clouding the judgment of the world ruler. And secondly, at the very end, he says, secondly, concerning the ability rather than the will to do justice, who could doubt such an ability in the world ruler if he understands the meaning of the term? For since he governs all, he can have no enemies. So a world ruler would both have no conflict of interest, would have the clearest judgment in the doing of justice, and would have the most ability to do it too. It's an argument for a monarchy, and really for a world monarchy. And it's an argument for a unified political structure. Now, again, I don't expect us to really seriously sort of agree with the politics of Dante here, but it's extremely interesting ideas.